January 17, 1945. Camp Concordia, Kansas. The winter wind swept across the flat expanse of the American heartland, carrying with it the scent of frozen earth and distant livestock. Inside a low-slung administrative building at the edge of the prisoner of war compound, a German Obergefreiter named Klaus Hartmann stood before a wooden desk, his calloused fingers trembling as they touched the cool metal of a gold band. It was no wider than a wheat stalk, scratched and dulled from 3 years of war, but when the American sergeant placed it in his palm without ceremony, without suspicion, Hartmann's throat tightened. He had not expected to see it again. None of them had. The ring had been taken from him the day he surrendered in Tunisia, catalogued with his other possessions in a brown envelope marked with his prisoner number. He had assumed, like so many things in war, that it was lost forever. But here it was, returned as routinely as a library book, accompanied only by a bored nod from the guard who seemed more interested in his coffee than in the small resurrection of dignity occurring before him. This was not how it was supposed to work. Klaus Hartmann had been taught, had believed with the fervor of youth and propaganda, that enemies stripped you of everything. That surrender meant humiliation, exploitation, perhaps death. That the Americans, those mongrel capitalists drunk on jazz and decadence, would treat captives with the same cruelty that had been demonstrated, expected, normalized across the battlefields of Europe. But the ring in his hand was warm now, heated by his own disbelief, and it contradicted everything he thought he understood about power, about conquest, about the nature of the enemy he had been fighting since 1942. To comprehend the shock that rippled through the German prisoner of war camps scattered across the continental United States, one must first understand the architecture of expectation built by the Third Reich. From the Hitler youth camps to the Wehrmacht training grounds, German soldiers had been conditioned with a singular narrative about their adversaries. The Americans were depicted as soft, fractured by racial division, corrupted by democracy's inefficiency, incapable of the discipline required for total war. They were a nation of individualists who could never match the collective will of the folk. Their wealth was an accident of geography, their military strength an illusion propped up by industrial luck rather than martial virtue. This was the gospel preached in 1,000 rallies, printed in 1,000,000 pamphlets, whispered in foxholes from the Ardennes to the North African sand. And yet, when hundreds of thousands of German soldiers found themselves prisoners on American soil, captured in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Rhineland, they encountered a reality that systematically dismantled the ideological framework they had carried across the Atlantic. The return of wedding rings was just one thread in a larger tapestry of cognitive dissonance, a small mercy that symbolized something far more dangerous to the Nazi worldview than any bullet: the quiet, pervasive demonstration that the enemy possessed a moral vocabulary the Reich had never taught them to expect. By January 1945, the United States held more than 371,000 German prisoners of war across hundreds of camps from New York to Texas, from Colorado to Florida. These were not the grim fortresses of barbed wire and starvation that populated the European imagination. They were, for the most part, functional communities governed by the Geneva Conventions, with a literalism that baffled their occupants. The prisoners received the same rations as American soldiers. They were paid for their labor. They had access to mail, to Red Cross parcels, to athletic equipment and musical instruments. And their personal effects, meticulously catalogued upon capture, were returned to them with bureaucratic efficiency that bordered on the absurd. The wedding rings became a focal point of this bewilderment. In the German military tradition, personal items taken from prisoners were often considered spoils of war, or, at minimum, security risks. Rings could be melted down, traded, confiscated without explanation. The notion that an enemy would carefully preserve such tokens, store them for months or years, then return them intact, suggested a legal framework and cultural restraint that did not fit the propaganda model. When German prisoners wrote letters home, letters that were read, censored, but ultimately delivered, they described this phenomenon with something approaching reverence. "They gave back my father's watch," wrote Gefreiter Ernst Bauer from Camp Mexia in Texas. "I cannot understand these people. They guard us, but they do not hate us." The wives in Germany, receiving these letters through the labyrinthine postal system that somehow continued functioning even as the Reich crumbled, responded with their own confusion and relief. Greta Hartmann, Klaus's wife, had spent 18 months believing her husband was either dead or enduring the sort of captivity her government assured her was the fate of all who fell into Anglo-American hands. The letter describing the return of his wedding ring arrived in Lübeck in March 1945, just weeks before British forces would occupy the city. She read it 3 times, sitting in the basement they used as an air raid shelter, trying to reconcile the image of her husband's captors, men who returned wedding rings, with the monsters she had been conditioned to fear. "I do not know if I am allowed to believe this," she wrote back in a letter that would never reach him before the war ended. "They say the Americans are cruel. They say prisoners starve. But you write of oranges. You write of your ring. What truth am I supposed to hold?" The cognitive dissonance was not limited to personal possessions. German prisoners arriving at camps across America were confronted with material abundance on a scale that defied comprehension. Men who had spent years on half rations, who had watched the Wehrmacht's supply lines collapse under the weight of overextension and Allied bombing, found themselves in a country where food was so plentiful it was wasted. The first meals in captivity often became the subject of obsessive documentation in letters and diaries. Unteroffizier Hans Wegner, captured at Aachen in October 1944, described his initial dinner at Camp Shelby, Mississippi: white bread, beef stew thick with vegetables, canned peaches, real coffee with sugar. He wrote that several men in his barracks wept while eating, not from gratitude, but from the horrifying realization that they had been lied to about the fundamental nature of the war. The wedding rings, then, were not merely objects. They became symbols of a larger revelation, a key that unlocked uncomfortable questions about authority, truth, and the narratives that had governed their lives. If the Americans were honorable enough to return a wedding ring, what else might have been a lie? If the enemy possessed such surplus that even prisoners ate better than civilians in Berlin, what did that say about the Reich's promises of inevitable victory? The rings were small, circular, golden contradictions that fit snugly on the 4th finger and weighed heavily on the conscience. The American policy of returning personal effects was rooted in adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States followed with almost legalistic precision. Article 6 stipulated that personal belongings, except for military equipment and documents, should be maintained throughout captivity. But compliance with international law does not fully explain the meticulousness of the American approach. Camp administrators kept detailed inventories. Rings were tagged with prisoner numbers, stored in individual envelopes, tracked through transfers between camps. This was not mere bureaucracy. It was a systematic performance of the rule of law, a demonstration that even in war, even with enemies, certain principles remained inviolable. Captain Edward Davison, the commandant of Camp Concordia, maintained a filing system that recorded every personal item of the 800 prisoners under his supervision. In a letter to his wife in 1944, he wrote, "We return their rings, their photographs, their prayer books, not because we love them, but because we are Americans, and that means something beyond victory. It means we do not become them, even when we defeat them." This was the paradox that the German prisoners struggled to articulate. Their captors' strength seemed to derive not from brutality, but from restraint, not from crushing the individual, but from acknowledging his humanity even in enmity. The reaction among prisoners varied. Some, the true believers, dismissed the returned rings as propaganda. a trick to soften them for interrogation or ideological conversion. These men, often officers or committed National Socialists, maintained their defiance, their conviction that American decency was a facade that would crack under pressure. But they were the minority. Most prisoners, especially the younger conscripts who had been swept into the Wehrmacht by demographic necessity rather than ideological fervor, found their worldview quietly collapsing under the accumulated weight of small mercies. The ring, the food, the medical care, the absence of torture, the Sunday soccer matches, the library books in German. Obergefreiter Hartmann wrote to his wife in April 1945, shortly before Germany's surrender. "I wear the ring you gave me in the church in Lübeck. I thought I would never see it again. But these strange captors, they gave it back as if it were nothing, as if such things were expected. Greta, I do not know how to tell you this, but I think we were wrong about many things. I think we were wrong about who we were fighting and why." The letters from prisoners' wives, those that survived the chaos of Germany's collapse, reveal a parallel transformation. These women had been told that their husbands in American captivity faced starvation, forced labor, execution. The Nazi propaganda machine, even as it ground to a halt in the spring of 1945, continued to pump out stories of Allied atrocities, warnings that surrender meant annihilation. The wives expected to become widows. They prepared for grief. Instead, they received letters describing wedding rings returned, parcels delivered, wages paid for labor that could be banked for post-war repatriation. Ilse Brunner, wife of a captured Feldwebel, wrote in her diary in April 1945, "The radio says the Americans are monsters, but Fritz writes of kindness. He writes of his ring, the one I placed on his finger 7 years ago. He says they gave it back to him without asking anything in return. I do not know who to believe anymore, the radio or my husband." This crisis of belief was precisely what made the wedding rings so symbolically potent. They were intimate objects, tokens of love and commitment, links to a life before war. Their return was personal in a way that adequate food rations or Geneva Convention compliance could never be. When a prisoner slipped his ring back onto his finger, he was reconnecting with an identity that had been submerged beneath uniform and prisoner number. He was being recognized not as a member of a defeated army, not as an ideological enemy, but as a man who had loved and been loved, who had made vows before God and witnesses, who belonged to a human story that transcended the temporary fact of his captivity. The American Guards, for their part, rarely grasped the significance of what they were doing. To them, returning personal effects was simply procedure, a checkbox on a form, a task completed before moving on to the next administrative duty. Captain Davison's filing system was not born of philosophical reflection on human dignity, but from military efficiency and legal compliance. The guards who handed back rings often did so with the same casual indifference with which they distributed mail or assigned work details. They could not see what the prisoners saw, that every small act of institutional fairness was a hammer blow against the totalitarian logic that had defined their captives' adult lives. By the summer of 1945, with Germany defeated and the full scope of Nazi atrocities becoming undeniable, the prisoner of war camps in America became sites of involuntary re-education, not through forced lectures or coercive propaganda, but through the accumulated experience of living under a system that operated by different rules. The returned wedding rings were part of a larger pattern. Newspapers available in camp libraries that reported honestly on the war's progress. Democratic elections for camp spokesmen that prisoners themselves organized. Mail call that connected them to families across the ocean. Work programs that paid wages. Medical care that made no distinction between guard and prisoner in quality of treatment. Gefreiter Bauer, writing from Camp Mexia in July 1945, after news of Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz had reached the camps, "I look at my ring and I feel ashamed. We were told we fought for civilization against barbarism. But they return our rings, and we built camps where such things could never be returned because there was no one left to return them to. I do not know how to live with this knowledge. The wives in Germany, emerging from the rubble of bombed cities, facing starvation and occupation, received their husbands' letters with complex emotions, relief that they were alive, confusion at the descriptions of captivity that contradicted everything they had been told, and gradually, for many, a dawning understanding that the war they had supported, or at least endured, had been built on lies more comprehensive than they could have imagined. The wedding ring became a talisman of this revelation, a small golden circle that marked the boundary between the world as they had been taught it was, and the world as it actually existed. Martha Zimmerman, whose husband was captured at Normandy and held at Camp Polk, Louisiana, wrote to her sister in September 1945, "Heinrich sent me a photograph. He is standing with other prisoners, and they are all wearing their rings. He says the Americans made sure everyone who wanted their ring back received it." I thought this was a lie at first. But there is the photograph. There are the rings. I do not understand the Americans. I do not understand how we could have been so wrong about them. And if we were wrong about that, what else were we wrong about? This was the true power of the returned wedding rings. They initiated a cascade of doubt, a questioning of foundational assumptions that the Nazi state had worked so hard to cement. If the enemy was honorable in this small thing, might he be honorable in larger things? If American abundance was real enough to feed prisoners better than German civilians, what did that say about the economic ideology of National Socialism? If democracy was strong enough to win a global war while still respecting the Geneva Convention, what did that say about the supposed efficiency of authoritarian rule? The rings became conversation pieces in the camps, physical evidence in debates that raged in barracks after lights out. The older prisoners, men who had fought in World War I, sometimes recognized in American conduct echoes of an older martial code, a sense that even in war, certain lines should not be crossed. The younger men, products of total indoctrination, struggled more deeply. They had been taught that such codes were obsolete, that total war required total commitment, that mercy was weakness. The ring on their finger suggested otherwise. There were, of course, darker undercurrents. Some prisoners refused to wear their returned rings, seeing them as symbols of emasculation, proof of defeat. Some wives in Germany, radicalized by propaganda or traumatized by bombing, rejected letters from captive husbands that spoke too kindly of American treatment, suspecting collaboration or coercion. The Nazi apparatus, even in its death throes, tried to maintain its narrative. German propaganda in early 1945 claimed that reports of good treatment in American camps were fabrications. The prisoners were being brainwashed, that the wedding rings were stage props for Red Cross inspectors. But the sheer volume of correspondence, the consistency of accounts across hundreds of camps and thousands of prisoners, made such denials increasingly hollow. By war's end, the return of personal effects had become one of the most frequently mentioned details in prisoner letters, alongside descriptions of food and wonder at the American industrial landscape visible beyond the fences. The rings were real. The oranges were real. The realization that everything they had been told about their enemy might be inverted was inescapably, devastatingly real in the immediate post-war period as prisoners began the slow process of repatriation. The wedding rings took on new significance. They were often the only possessions men carried back across the Atlantic, links to a continuity that the war had tried to sever. When Klaus Hartmann returned to Lübeck in November 1945, stepping off a transport ship in Hamburg and traveling north through the ruins, the ring on his finger was the same one Greta had placed there in 1940. It had survived Tunisia, American captivity, and the collapse of the Reich. He wrote in a letter to Captain Davison, one of the few prisoners to maintain correspondence with his former captors. "The ring you returned to me was the only thing that remained unchanged. Everything else, my country, my beliefs, my understanding of the world, all of it was destroyed. But the ring remained. I think perhaps that is what you were trying to tell us all along. The wives who reunited with returned prisoners often focused on the rings in their first moments together, touching them to confirm they were real, that the man before them was real, that the nightmare had ended, and something resembling normal life might be possible again. Greta Hartmann recalled decades later in an interview for a German documentary on the prisoner of war experience. When Klaus came home, the first thing I noticed was the ring. It was still there. He told me the Americans had kept it safe for him for 3 years. I could not understand it then. I was angry at first. Angry that the enemy had been more careful with my husband than our own government had been with us. But later I understood. The ring meant that even in war, even between enemies, there could be decency. It was a small thing, but it mattered more than he could say. The historical record bears out the systematic nature of American adherence to Geneva Convention requirements regarding personal property. Red Cross inspection reports from 1943 through 1945 consistently noted that camps maintained detailed inventories and that personal items were returned to prisoners promptly when requested. In some cases, items were shipped to other camps when prisoners were transferred, following the prisoner through the bureaucratic maze of the POW system. The military's Judge Advocate General's office produced regular memoranda emphasizing that personal effects policies were not merely legal requirements, but also strategic tools, demonstrating to both prisoners and the international community that the United States conducted war within ethical boundaries. General Dwight Eisenhower, in a 1944 directive to camp commandants, wrote, "The treatment of prisoners is not an act of charity, but an obligation of civilized warfare. Every returned watch, every delivered letter, every fair hearing is a demonstration of the principles we claim to defend. These men will return to Germany someday. Let them return with the knowledge that democracy, even in war, does not abandon its values." This was the strategic calculation behind the wedding rings, that prisoners were not merely bodies to be contained, but minds to be persuaded, witnesses to a system that functioned differently than they had been taught. The policy was effective beyond its architect's expectations. Post-war surveys of German prisoners who had been held in American camps revealed that a significant majority returned to Germany with fundamentally altered views about democracy, capitalism, and American society. The rings were mentioned in interviews with surprising frequency, not because they were materially valuable, but because they represented something the prisoners had been told did not exist. An enemy who could be trusted to keep his word, even in matters as small as a catalogued personal effect. The symbolic weight of the wedding rings extended beyond individual experiences. In the decades after the war, as Germany reckoned with its past and rebuilt its society, former prisoners often pointed to their time in American camps as pivotal in their political development. The return of the rings became shorthand in these narratives for a larger lesson about the relationship between power and morality. Men who entered camps as convinced National Socialists sometimes left as Democrats, not because they had been subjected to re-education programs, but because they had lived within a system that demonstrated, through 1,000 small actions, that authority could be exercised without cruelty, that rules could apply equally to captors and captives, that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded. Historians examining the American prisoner of war system have sometimes criticized it for being too lenient, for failing to impose sufficient hardship on captured enemy soldiers, while Allied prisoners in German and Japanese camps suffered and died. There is merit to this critique when viewed through the lens of reciprocity and justice. But the strategic value of the American approach became evident in the post-war period. Germany's reconstruction as a democratic ally was facilitated by a generation of men who had seen democracy in action, who carried home not just stories of defeat, but evidence of an alternative system that worked. The wedding rings, and all they symbolized, were investments in that future. By the time of Klaus Hartmann's death in 1982, he had spent more of his life as a citizen of democratic West Germany than he had as a subject of the Third Reich. In his final years, suffering from the illnesses of old age, he would sometimes turn the wedding ring on his finger and tell his grandchildren about the American sergeant in Kansas who had returned it to him without ceremony, without expectation of gratitude, simply because it was procedure. That, he would say, was when I first understood that we had lost more than a war. We had lost the argument about how human beings should treat one another. The physical rings themselves, most of them, have been lost to time, sold for scrap in lean post-war years, buried with their owners, passed to children who did not know their history. But the symbolic ring, the idea of the ring, persists in the historical memory of German-American relations. It appears in memoirs, in documentary films, in academic studies of prisoner-of-war policy. It has become a metonym for the broader experience of German prisoners in American captivity, and for the quiet transformation that occurred when expectation met reality. The wives, many of whom outlived their husbands and saw the reunification of Germany and the final closing of the Cold War divide, carried their own understanding of what the rings meant. They had lived through the Nazi years as believers, skeptics, or mere survivors. They had endured the collapse of everything familiar, and they had received letters from captivity that challenged the totalizing narrative their government had imposed. The rings their husbands described, returned with bureaucratic indifference by an enemy that was supposed to be barbaric, became proof that reality was more complex than propaganda, that the world contained possibilities for decency that ideology could not account for. In the end, the story of the returned wedding rings is not really about jewelry or policy compliance. It is about the collision between ideology and experience, about the fragility of totalitarian narratives when confronted with persistent contrary evidence. It is about small acts of institutional fairness that accumulated into a philosophical earthquake. It is about objects that weighed a few grams but carried the weight of civilizational difference. The German prisoners who received their rings back expected humiliation. They found procedure. They expected cruelty. They found indifference leavened with occasional kindness. They expected their captors to behave as they themselves had been taught to behave toward the defeated. Instead, they encountered a system that treated them according to written rules, that recognized their humanity even in their enemy status, that returned to them the small golden circles that symbolized love and commitment, and a life outside of war, and their wives, reading letters from across the ocean, had to reconcile the monsters of propaganda with the men who returned wedding rings, had to choose between the comforting lie that their sacrifice had been for a righteous cause and the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived about the fundamental nature of the conflict. Many chose truth. The rings, and all they represented, made that choice easier. As the winter wind continued to sweep across the Kansas plains, as it swept across 1,000 other camps scattered across a vast and abundant nation, the returned wedding rings caught the light. Small gold circles, unremarkable in themselves, but luminous with meaning to the men who wore them, and the women who waited for them across the sea. They were proof that even in the machinery of total war, even between implacable enemies, there could be moments of grace. Not because grace was strategically optimal, though it proved to be, but because grace was possible. Because a system built on certain principles would follow those principles even when no one was watching, even when the beneficiaries were the enemy, even in details as small as cataloging and returning a wedding ring. That was the lesson that could not be unlearned, the knowledge that could not be erased by propaganda or rationalization. The rings came back, and in coming back, they testified to a truth more powerful than any military victory, that the measure of a civilization is not found in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats its enemies. That abundance shared is more threatening to tyranny than abundance hoarded. That the small mercies, the bureaucratic decencies, the unglamorous adherence to written rules, These are the things that endure when the guns fall silent and the ideologies collapse. The German prisoners went home. Most of the rings went with them, and America, having demonstrated in 1,000 quiet ways what it meant to fight a war without abandoning the values that made the fight necessary, turned its attention to rebuilding the world it had just finished saving. The rings remained, on fingers or in memory, small golden testaments to the possibility that even in humanity's darkest hours, some light persists. Not because darkness is weak, but because light, properly tended, proves stronger than we dare to hope.